The last days of June, 2018. A store somewhere in America, one day before its final day. An employee walks the aisles with her phone out, because there is nothing left to sell and nothing left to do. The shelves are bare. The carts are lined up empty by the door. And near the front of the store, propped against a stripped display, someone has left the cardboard giraffe holding a small suitcase, waving goodbye. She takes the picture. She posts it that night with 3 words: "My heart is breaking." Within days, that photograph has been shared roughly 300,000 times. A country that had not set foot in the store in years sat at its kitchen tables and wept over a cartoon animal with a cardboard suitcase. If you were an American child at any point between 1960 and 2015, you already know the room she was standing in. The bicycles hanging from the ceiling on chains, the wall of board games in shrink wrap, the bin of rubber playground balls, so full that pulling one out sent 4 more bouncing down the aisle. The doll aisle bathed in pink light. The little paper tickets hanging under the video games, because the games themselves lived behind a locked counter and you had to carry your ticket to a grown-up like a boarding pass. And the song. You can hear it right now, whether you want to or not. I don't want to grow up. Ask an American why that store died, and you will hear the same answer almost every time. It was Amazon, or it was Walmart, or the toys were just too expensive. Hold on to that last one. The toys were too expensive. That is the folk explanation, the thing people's mothers told them, and it is repeated in the comments section of every video ever made about this company. It is also, as you are about to see, the single best piece of evidence in the case, pointing at a culprit almost nobody has ever named. At its height, this company sold 1 out of every 4 toys bought in the United States. It had killed every serious rival in its category, some of them so completely that their names have vanished from memory. In its final year, it still ran roughly 1,600 stores around the world and employed 64,000 people. And it did not die of the internet. It died of a document. 69 pages of it, signed in a conference room in Manhattan on a Thursday in March 2005, 13 years before the giraffe picked up his suitcase. Everything that happened afterward, including the price on that toy your mother would not buy you, was written into that document before it happened. This is the story of Toys R Us, and of what it costs to buy a company with its own money. The Cryptographer, 1948. A young man is standing in his father's bicycle shop, and he is thinking about arithmetic. His name is Charles Lazarus. He is 24 years old. He has just come home from the Second World War, and he spent that war as a cryptographer, a code man, someone paid to find the pattern hiding inside the noise. His father repairs bicycles. It is honest work in a poor neighborhood, and Charles can see exactly how far it goes, which is not very. But he can also see something happening out on the sidewalk. The soldiers are home. They are getting married at a rate the country has never recorded before, and they are having children, a wave of children, the largest in American history, arriving all at once. Charles Lazarus looks at that street and does the only sensible thing a code man can do. He asks what those people are about to need. They need cribs, so he clears out his father's shop and fills it with baby furniture, and he calls it Children's Bargain Town. Cribs, high chairs, playpens, strollers. Business is good. Business is, in fact, so good that within a few years he has a genuine problem, and the problem is the thing that made him rich. He said it himself, years later, in plainer words than any consultant ever managed. A family buys 1 crib. They do not come back for a second one. They do not need another high chair or another playpen as the family grows. But every single child needs toys. And they need new ones every year, forever. That is the whole company. That is the entire idea. And Charles Lazarus had it before he was 30. Furniture is a transaction. Toys are a subscription. Now hold that sentence in your mind. Because in about half an hour, a group of men in Manhattan are going to look at the same company and see something completely different. They will not see a subscription. They will see an asset. Lazarus started adding toys to the baby furniture. Customers bought them. He added more. They bought those too. And by the middle of the 1950s, the toys had eaten the furniture entirely, which left him with a decision about what kind of toy store to build. In 1957, he opened his answer in Rockville, Maryland. He did not call it Children's Bargain Town. He called it Toys R Us. And he did something to the sign that would become one of the most recognized pieces of graphic design in the country. He turned the R around backwards, so it faced the wrong way, because that is how a small child writes. And a small child was the only customer he actually cared about. The adults paid, but the child chose. Charles Lazarus understood that distinction better than anyone in American retail, and he built a building around it. A supermarket for toys. Rockville, Maryland, 1957. To understand why the new store was radical, you have to understand what buying a toy in America used to mean. It meant a counter. It meant a clerk standing behind a glass case, and a child pointing, and an adult asking to see something, and the clerk taking it down and handing it over. Toys lived in department stores, and in small specialty shops, and in both cases they were kept away from the people who wanted them most. The store was in charge. Lazarus threw all of that out. He had watched the grocery business invent the supermarket, and he simply applied it to childhood. Enormous room, steel warehouse shelving, every toy in the store out in the open, at eye level, in bulk, stacked to the ceiling. No clerk between the child and the object. You took a cart, and you pushed it down the aisle, and the toys were right there, and you could touch them. It is difficult now to convey how overwhelming this was. Adults who walked into one of those early stores described a kind of vertigo. Children described something closer to a religious experience, and 40 years later they still do. Read the comments under any video about this company, and the same word appears over and over, from grown men and women in their 50s. Magical. It felt like a theme park. It was the best feeling in the world, and there was cold arithmetic underneath the wonder. Self-service meant fewer staff per square foot. Bulk buying meant lower prices than any department store toy counter could match. Enormous stores meant enormous selection, which meant nobody had to shop anywhere else. Lazarus had the whole formula in 1957, 2 decades before American business invented a phrase for it. The phrase, when it came, was category killer. A store so large and so cheap and so total in one single category that competing with it is not a strategy but a form of suicide. He grew fast, and then he made a mistake that nearly ended everything. In 1966, Lazarus sold his 4 stores to a company called Interstate Stores for $7.5 million, staying on to run the toy division. Interstate was an old public company with department stores and discount chains, and it wanted a growth engine. What it had instead was a disaster in its other divisions. By 1974, Interstate Stores collapsed into what was, at that moment, one of the largest bankruptcies in the history of American retail. And here is the strange part. Inside the wreckage, one division was thriving. 51 toy stores, profitable, growing, entirely healthy, attached to a corpse. It took 4 years in the courts to sort out. When Interstate Stores finally emerged in 1978, it had shed the department stores and the discounters and kept the only thing worth keeping. The reorganized company was renamed after its best asset. It was now called Toys R Us, Incorporated. And Charles Lazarus was its president. He had watched a mountain of corporate debt destroy a company from the inside, while its healthiest division stood there, helpless, unable to save itself. He would spend the next 20 years running his own company as if that could never be allowed to happen again, with cash, with a fortress balance sheet, with an almost old-fashioned horror of borrowing. Remember that too. It is going to matter enormously. I don't want to grow up. New York City, 1982. In an office at a large advertising agency, a 34-year-old creative director is working on a jingle for a toy chain, and he is not yet the man he will be remembered as. His name is James Patterson. Decades later, he will be the best-selling novelist on the planet. Right now he is in advertising, and working alongside a junior copywriter named Linda Kaplan-Thaler, he comes up with a line that will outlive nearly everything else either of them writes. I don't want to grow up. I'm a Toys R Us kid. Kaplan-Thaler assumed it was a temporary campaign. Then she was walking down a street in New York and heard a small boy singing it to himself, and heard his mother ask him please to stop so they could get to school on time. That was the moment she understood. The children had taken it. It was theirs now. That jingle ran, in one form or another, for the better part of 30 years. And it did something no advertisement is supposed to do. It made a chain of concrete warehouses into a promise about time. Not a promise about toys. A promise that you would not have to grow up yet. That there was a building you could go to where being a child was the entire point. The mascot did the same work in a different register. Geoffrey the giraffe had been kicking around the company's advertising since the 1950s, back when he was drawn as a rather stiff cartoon and called Dr. Giraffe. By the 1970s, he had softened into the friendly figure everyone remembers, and he became the closest thing American retail ever produced to a genuine childhood character. Not a logo, a character. Children wrote letters to him. Adults, decades later, would cry over a cardboard cutout of him holding a suitcase. Underneath the song and the giraffe sat the rituals, and the rituals are what people actually remember. They are astonishingly specific, and they are shared by tens of millions of people who have never met. The catalogue arriving in autumn, thick as a phone book, and the ritual of going through it with a pen, circling. The store visit that was not for you, an errand with your mother, where the reward for good behavior was that you could pick one thing. 1. The negotiation that followed, conducted at a level of diplomatic skill children reserve for exactly this situation. The bicycles overhead, the bin of oversized rubber balls, which existed to be raced down the aisle when adults were not looking. The doll aisle, which was pink from the floor to the ceiling and glowed like a chapel. The Lego wall, which had every set, including the enormous ones that were clearly not for sale to anyone with your allowance, displayed at a height where you could only stare. And the video games. The games themselves were locked behind the counter, because a cartridge was worth more than the shelf it would have sat on. So instead the company hung little paper tickets on hooks under each display box. You found the game you wanted, you took its ticket, and you carried that flimsy piece of paper to the register like a passport. The clerk took your ticket to the back and returned with the actual box. Grown men in their 40s still describe the walk from the game aisle to the counter, ticket in hand, as one of the most intensely felt journeys of their childhood. There was a birthday club, because of course there was, and it worked on a principle every retailer since has tried and failed to copy. A child's birthday is a fixed, non-negotiable annually recurring event, known in advance, attached to a household with a budget. Register the child, and the company knew the date. A card would arrive, sometimes a small crown, and a family that might otherwise have gone to a department store found itself, on a specific Saturday, in a specific parking lot, for reasons it could not entirely explain. And underneath all of it was a sound. Anyone who was there can still hear it, the particular acoustics of a very large room with a concrete floor and steel shelving and 40 children in it. Wheels on tile. Someone's demonstration toy going off in aisle 6, over and over, because a 4-year-old had found the button. The rattle of a cart with one bad wheel. It was, by the standards of adult retail, an appalling amount of noise. To a child it sounded exactly like being allowed. That is the machine Charles Lazarus built, not a store. A rite of passage, running on a national schedule, renewed every birthday and every December. And in the 1980s it went to war. The category killer, Paramus, New Jersey, 1983. In a low corporate building in northern New Jersey, executives are watching a map. The map has dots on it, and the dots are multiplying. The 1980s belonged to this company completely. The store count went from about 100 at the start of the decade to more than 300 in the United States by 1988, plus new countries, Canada, Singapore, then Britain and beyond. The sales figures read like a rocket telemetry printout. $750 million in fiscal 1981, past $1 billion in 1983, $4 billion by 1988, $5.5 billion by 1990. And there was the number that mattered most, the one that made the entire toy industry rearrange itself. By 1989, Toys R Us was selling 1 out of every 4 toys purchased in the United States, 25% of a $13 billion market, held by a single chain. That is not market leadership. That is a choke point. If you manufactured toys in America in 1989, you did not really have customers. You had a customer. What the buyers in New Jersey chose to stock became what American children played with, and what they declined to stock quietly ceased to exist. Toy companies designed products to fit the shelf heights in those stores, and a company will always, eventually, use a choke point. In the early 1990s, a new kind of competitor appeared, the warehouse club, Costco and its imitators, selling a smaller range of toys at prices Toys R Us did not like seeing in print. So the buyers in New Jersey had a series of conversations with the manufacturers. The message was not complicated. Sell the popular toys to the clubs, and reconsider your relationship with the company that buys 30% of your output. 10 toy makers went along with it, including the largest names in the industry. The clubs found themselves offered only odd combination packs rather than the toys children actually asked for. Costco's toy sales, which had been growing faster than the rest of its business, went into reverse the year the arrangement took hold. The Federal Trade Commission took the case, and in October 1998 it ruled against Toys R Us, and ordered the practice stopped. The decision was upheld on appeal. It is worth sitting with that for a moment, because this story is usually told as a straightforward tragedy, and it is not one. At its peak, This company was not a beloved underdog. It was a monopolist in a paper crown, leaning on suppliers to keep cheaper competitors away from the shelves, which is to say it did to Costco, imperfectly, what Walmart was about to do to it, permanently. The rivals did not survive contact. Lionel Leisure, 98 toy stores, went into bankruptcy in 1982. Child World, the number 2 chain with 150 stores, fought for a decade and lost because the numbers were simply not close. Toys R Us was pulling well over $300 in annual sales out of every square foot of its floor. Child World was pulling barely $220. In retail, a gap like that is not a competition, it is a countdown. Meanwhile, the company kept finding new categories to swallow. Kids R Us, the clothing chain, launched in 1983. Babies R Us arrived in 1996, and it was a genuine triumph. The store expectant parents were sent to by everyone they knew, stocked with cribs and car seats and a registry system, quietly generating 3/4 of the company's operating profit on 15% of its sales. In 1997, the company bought a rival baby chain outright for $376 million in cash. That is the Lazarus signature. And by the end of the decade, the company was sitting on a balance sheet that would look, in hindsight, like an invitation. The high water mark was pure theater. In November 2001, Toys R Us opened a flagship in Times Square, 110,000 square feet, $35 million, 3 stories of glass on the most expensive advertising real estate on earth, with an indoor Ferris wheel that ran all day inside the store. It was, briefly, the largest toy store in the world. Tourists queued to ride a Ferris wheel indoors in Manhattan. Microsoft chose it as the place to launch the original Xbox. It looked like a coronation. It was, in fact, a very expensive photograph of a company that had already begun to lose. The first crack. Bentonville, Arkansas, 1990. In a plain office in northwest Arkansas, someone is looking at the same toy market and running a completely different calculation. Walmart did not enter the toy business to make money on toys. It entered the toy business to sell everything else. A toy at Christmas is what retailers call a loss leader, priced at cost, or below it, not to earn a margin but to get a family through the doors in December, when that family will also buy a television and a coat and 4 bags of groceries and wrapping paper. Think carefully about what that means for a company that sells only toys. Toys R Us had built its entire existence on being the cheapest place to buy a toy, and it could not answer this. Not because it was badly run, but because of arithmetic. Walmart could afford to make nothing on a bicycle. Toys R Us had to make something on the bicycle, because the bicycle was the whole business. Target followed the same playbook. So did every large discounter in the country. Market share numbers tell the story without commentary. Just over 25% in 1990. Down to 18% by 1997. And in 1999, Walmart passed Toys R Us to become the largest toy seller in the United States, a position it has never given back. There is a bitter joke inside all this. The category killer had been killed by the category killer's own weapon, deployed by someone with deeper pockets and more categories, and the product itself was moving underneath them at the same time. The most desirable toy in America was quietly becoming an electronic one. A console, a handheld, a cartridge, and electronics have thin margins and are sold everywhere. A child who once wanted 11 separate toys now wanted one machine and a stack of games for it. Toys R Us sold those machines, and sold them well, and made far less on each of them than it had made on a shelf of action figures. The company's response through the 1990s was real, and it was mostly sensible. Store formats were redesigned. The clothing chain was eventually shut down as a failure. Management brought in a new chief executive in 2000, John Eyler, who came from the luxury toy retailer FAO Schwarz, and understood that a warehouse full of steel shelving could not out-cheap Walmart, and would therefore have to out-charm it. The Times Square store, the new store designs, the emphasis on exclusive products, all of that was Eyler's answer, and it was a defensible answer. But the ground was shifting under a second front at exactly the same time, and this is where the story turns from misfortune into something closer to tragedy. Because in the year 2000, with the internet arriving and the company's future genuinely in play, Toys R Us made a deal that looked brilliant on the day it was signed. The second crack. Seattle, August 2000. 2 companies announce a partnership, and both sides believe they have won. The arrangement was this. Toys R Us would stop trying to build its own e-commerce operation, and would instead become the exclusive toy and baby seller on Amazon.com. Toys R Us would choose and buy the inventory. Amazon would run the website, the warehouse operations, the checkout, and the customer relationship. It was a 10-year contract, and Toys R Us paid handsomely for it. A per-year fee plus a cut of the revenue. On paper, it solved everything. Toys R Us had already been humiliated online, badly and publicly. In the 1999 Christmas season, its website took orders it could not physically fulfill. The warehouses had never been designed to pick and pack single toys for individual households, only to load pallets onto trucks bound for stores. Days before Christmas, the company had to email families to tell them the presents were not coming. It sent out apology gift certificates. It was, at the time, one of the most notorious failures of the early internet, and it cost the company a fine from federal regulators for the delivery promises it had made. Amazon, by contrast, was the best logistics operation on the internet. Let the specialists do the internet. We will do the toys. Read the contract's central promise again, though, because everything depends on one word. Exclusive. Toys R Us was to be the only seller of toys on that website. Within a few years, that was no longer true. Amazon began allowing third-party merchants to sell toys on its platform, first in a trickle, then as a foundational part of what Amazon was becoming. Toys R Us watched the traffic it was paying for get diverted to competitors on a site it did not control. And in 2004 it did the only thing left to do. It sued. The litigation dragged. In 2006 a New Jersey court ruled that Amazon had breached the agreement and freed Toys R Us from the contract. There was eventually a settlement, in 2009, in which Amazon paid $51 million. $51 million. Let that number sit for a moment, next to what it actually purchased. The lawsuit was won. The decade was gone. From 2000 to 2006, during precisely the years when every serious American retailer was learning, expensively, painfully, and permanently, how to run an online business, Toys R Us had outsourced its entire education to the company that would eventually eat it. When the divorce came through, Toys R Us had no meaningful web platform, no logistics network of its own, no institutional memory of e-commerce whatsoever, and a customer base that had spent 6 years being trained to buy toys on Amazon. They got a check. Amazon got the decade. And in the middle of that lost decade, while the lawsuit was still grinding through the courts and the share price was going nowhere, the board of Toys R Us made a decision that put the company on the table. March 17, 2005. A Thursday. In a conference room high above the city, 3 of the most sophisticated investment firms in the world signed their names to the purchase of an American childhood. This is the moment. Everything before it is a company having a hard time in a changing market, which is ordinary and survivable, and happens to every retailer eventually. Everything after it is something else. Start with what the board was trying to do, because they were not fools. Under pressure from Walmart, and with the stock going nowhere, the company had spent roughly 7 months on a strategic review. The original idea was to sell off the struggling global toy business and keep Babies R Us, which was the crown jewel. Instead, the bidding turned into an auction for the whole company, and on that Thursday a consortium of Kohlberg Kravis Roberts, Bain Capital, and Vornado Realty Trust beat out a rival bid and bought all of it. The price was $6.6 billion, $26.75 per share. Now, this is the part that most people have never had explained to them, and it is the hinge of the entire story, so let us go slowly. When you or I buy a house, we borrow money, and we owe it. The debt follows us. If we cannot pay, we lose the house and our credit and possibly a great deal more. A leveraged buyout does not work like that. In a leveraged buyout, the buyers put down a relatively small amount of their own money and borrow the rest. And then, at the closing, the borrowed money is placed onto the books of the company that was just purchased. The company becomes the borrower. The company owes the money. The company must now generate enough cash, every quarter, forever, to pay interest on the loan that was used to buy it. Read that again if you need to. Toys R Us was purchased with Toys R Us's own future earnings, pledged in advance. If you want the version with a house in it, here it is. Imagine you buy a home for $600,000. You put down $130,000 of your own money and you borrow the rest. And then, at the closing, you hand the mortgage to the house. The house owes it. The house must now go out and earn the payments. If the roof needs replacing, that money has to come from whatever is left after the bank is paid, and the bank is always paid first. And you, the buyer, charge the house a fee for the trouble of having bought it, and another fee every year for your advice on how it should be run. There is nothing illegal about any of this. It is a completely ordinary, widely practiced, and enormously profitable form of American finance. It works beautifully on companies with stable earnings and no need to reinvent themselves. It works very badly on a retailer standing at the beginning of the internet. The three firms put in something on the order of $1.3 billion of their own equity. More than $5 billion in debt landed on the company. A business that had been famous for a fortress balance sheet, run for 40 years by a man who had personally watched corporate debt destroy his life's work in 1974, woke up on a Friday morning owing more money than it had ever owed in its history, for a transaction it had not initiated and from which it received nothing. Not $1 of that $6.6 billion went into a store. Not $1 went into the website that was, at that exact moment, the company's most urgent strategic problem. The money went to the shareholders who sold. The chief executive who negotiated the sale, John Eiler, walked away with a payout reported at $65.3 million. And the last public trade in the company's stock went through that July at $26.75 a share. After that, no outside investor could see inside the building. The lights in the windows stayed on for another 13 years. What was happening behind them stopped being anybody's business. Here is the sentence that should follow you for the rest of this video. From that Thursday onward, Toys R Us was not primarily in the business of selling toys to children. It was in the business of generating cash to service a loan. Everything you are about to watch is that sentence, playing out slowly, in public, over 13 years, in front of a country that never once understood what it was looking at. The Slow Squeeze. Wayne, New Jersey, 2008. Somewhere in the finance department, a person is doing a subtraction that has become the most important calculation in the company. Interest first, everything else after. The number was roughly $400 million a year. $400 million, before a single register rang, before a single store was painted, before a single engineer was hired to build a website. That is not an abstraction. That is a real amount of real money that had to be extracted from real customers every year and handed to lenders. Let us convert it into something you can see. $400 million a year is enough to have completely renovated well over 100 stores annually, every year, for 13 years. It is enough to have built an e-commerce operation from scratch several times over. It is, put bluntly, enough money to have solved every strategic problem the company actually had. Instead, it went out the door as interest. Now go back and pick up the thread we left at the very beginning. The thing everybody says. The thing your mother told you. The toys were too expensive. She was right. She was completely right. Toys R Us was routinely more expensive than Walmart, than Target, and later than Amazon. Sometimes by a few dollars on a Lego set, sometimes by more. Millions of American families noticed, and quietly changed where they shopped, and to this day describe that as the reason the company failed. But now you know what was sitting inside that price. The extra few dollars was not greed, and it was not incompetence. It was interest on a loan that had been used to buy the company from its own shareholders, being collected from you, at the register, one toy at a time, for 13 years. There is a detail here that is almost too sad to be true. In the final years, the stores had quietly begun matching the online prices of major competitors. If a customer asked, they simply did not advertise it, because advertising costs money, and money was for interest. Customers who happened to discover the policy by overhearing a conversation at the service desk were astonished. Everyone else went on believing the store was ripping them off. And this is where you can see the machine most clearly, because the company was not failing at retail. Strip out the interest payments, and Toys R Us was running an operating profit through most of these years. It sold something like $11 billion worth of toys annually. Customers still came. The problem was never that the business could not make money. The problem was that the business could not make enough money to feed the debt and defend itself at the same time. So it stopped defending itself. The stores aged. Anyone who walked into one between 2010 and 2017 remembers it. The tired carpet, the shelves that had not been reset, the fluorescent light that had been flickering since the previous administration. Employees describe management pleading for basic maintenance budgets. Meanwhile, Target renovated, Walmart renovated, Amazon built. The cash reserve that Charles Lazarus had spent 40 years accumulating went from about $2.2 billion before the buyout to roughly $300 million by 2017. The Times Square flagship, That 110,000 square foot cathedral with the Ferris wheel, closed at the end of December 2015, unable to justify Manhattan rent. And through all of it, the three firms that had bought the company were being paid. This is the part that tends to make people quiet. Across the life of the deal, Kohlberg Kravis Roberts, Bain Capital, and Vornado collected something in the region of $464 million from Toys R Us. Advisory fees running about $15 million a year and rising. Transaction fees each time the debt was refinanced, plus interest on debt they themselves held. $81 million of that was charged in 2005 alone, as a fee for conducting the purchase. The company paid its new owners a fee for having been bought. Hold that $464 million figure. You are going to need it in about 10 minutes, when we get to what was offered to the people who worked there. The holiday that didn't come. Wayne, New Jersey, September 18, 2017. The company files for Chapter 11 bankruptcy protection, carrying about $5 billion in long-term debt and roughly 64,000 employees worldwide. The stated plan was reorganization, not death. Shed the worst stores, restructure the debt, come out leaner. Management believed it. A great many analysts believed it too, because the underlying business still sold billions of dollars of toys to people who wanted them. But look at the calendar. September 18th. A toy retailer earns something like 40% of its annual revenue in the final weeks of the year. Filing for bankruptcy protection in the third week of September meant walking into the only season that mattered with the word bankruptcy attached to the company's name in every newspaper in the country. Two things followed immediately, and both were fatal. The suppliers moved first. Toy manufacturers, who had spent decades depending on this company, now had to decide whether to ship millions of dollars of inventory to a business in bankruptcy proceedings. Many tightened terms or held product back. Stores went into December with gaps on the shelves. Then the customers moved. Nobody buys a gift card from a chain that might not exist in March. Nobody makes the last-minute Christmas Eve run to a store they have read might be closing. And that last-minute panic run had been one of the most profitable habits in the entire business. The one purchase where Toys R Us could not be beaten on convenience, because a shipped package could not arrive in 2 hours. The holiday season came in below the worst case in the company's own projections. Earnings fell roughly $250 million short of target. The company defaulted on the emergency financing that was keeping the lights on. By January, it was burning between $50 and $100 million a month, and it needed several hundred million more just to keep operating into the spring. Roughly 40 potential buyers and lenders were approached. 10 signed a confidentiality agreement. None of them wrote a check. On March 15, 2018, the lenders concluded that they would recover more money by liquidating the company than by saving it. That is the whole decision. Not a judgment about toys, or children, or the internet. A calculation about recovery rates, made by creditors who had inherited the wreckage of a transaction signed 13 years earlier. The court approved the wind-down of the American business the same day. 60 days. Wayne, New Jersey, March 2018. More than 30,000 people are told, in writing, that they will lose their jobs within 60 days. What happened next is the part of this story that is least known and hardest to forgive. The employees of Toys R Us received no severance, not reduced severance, none. Cashiers with a decade behind the register, store managers with 20 and 30 years, the people who had run the Christmas rush and taken the paper tickets to the back for the video games, they were told to work through the liquidation sale, dismantling the store around themselves, and then to go home with their final paycheck and nothing else. The company had a severance plan. In bankruptcy, obligations to employees sit near the bottom of the queue, well below the secured lenders. The money went where the paperwork said it went. Meanwhile, the wind-down had its own indignities. Staff describe watching liquidation firms take over their stores and raise prices on some items before discounting them. They describe customers arriving to strip the shelves of the place they claimed to love, and asking whether they could buy the fixtures. They describe, over and over, the specific misery of a toy store with nothing in it. One employee, a former store manager, later wrote a single line online that says everything about what these jobs meant to the people who held them. She said she had been a Toys R Us adult, that she had loved the job, and that she had kept a slinky on her desk for stress. Another described the closing ritual from the 1990s, the reshop, done after the last customer left, sometimes at 1 in the morning, walking the aisles with a cart returning every abandoned toy to its home. Somebody did that every night, in every store, for 60 years. so that the shelves would be perfect when the doors opened and the children came in. And there is one more group worth naming, because they were in the stores right to the end, and nobody counts them. The adult collectors. Somewhere around the 2000s, a certain kind of grown-up had made a weekly habit of walking the action figure aisle. Not for a child, but for themselves, checking what had come in. They knew the delivery days. They knew which employee would tell them what was in the back. When the liquidation started, they were the ones buying the display fixtures, and several of them have since written that they kept a shelf tag or an aisle sign, and still have it. On March 22, 2018, 1 week after the liquidation order, 1 day before the going out of business sales began, Charles Lazarus died in a hospital in New York City. He was 94 years old, a cryptographer who had looked at a street full of returning soldiers in 1948 and worked out what came next, had lived exactly long enough to see the end of the thing he built, and not 1 day longer. His family said only that the news of the past weeks had been very hard on him. The stores emptied through the spring. The last of them in the United States closed on June 29, 2018, 70 years after a young man cleared the bicycles out of his father's shop to make room for cribs. And on one of those final days, in a stripped store somewhere in America, an employee found the cardboard giraffe, gave him a suitcase, propped him near the door, and took a photograph. What they took. Somewhere in America today. The building is still standing. They almost always are. The shape is unmistakable if you know what you are looking at. The long low box, the enormous parking lot, the outline on the facade where the letters used to be, with the round shadow where the backwards are sat. Some of them are furniture showrooms now. Some are gyms, or grocery stores, or seasonal Halloween shops for 6 weeks a year. There is a joke that runs through every comment section on this subject, and like most good jokes, it is mostly grief. Someday this will be a spirit Halloween. So let us finish the arithmetic, because this story does have an ending, and it is not the one you would expect. The employees did not simply accept it. Through 2018, former Toys R Us workers organized, traveling to shareholder meetings, lobbying state pension funds that had invested in the private equity firms, showing up in person where the money lived. In November 2018, Kohlberg, Kravis Roberts and Bain Capital agreed to establish a hardship fund for the workers. It was $20 million. $20 million, divided among more than 30,000 people. Now put it beside the number from earlier. $464 million in fees and interest, collected by the owners from the company across the life of the deal. The workers, organizing from nothing, recovered about 4 cents for every dollar the deal had paid the firms that ran it. And even that was described at the time as a landmark, because it was. Nothing like it had happened before. Tornado, Bain and Kohlberg Kravis Roberts collectively lost their equity when the company failed. Something like $1.3 billion of it. And they will tell you so, correctly, if you ask. That is true. It is also beside the point. They lost an investment. The people who worked there lost a career, and a pension contribution, and a severance check they had earned and never saw. And they had no say in the transaction that decided it. Few corrections before we close, because this story is often told badly. Toys R Us is not gone from the world. What died in 2018 was the American company. The Canadian business was sold and continues under its own ownership, which is why Canadians reading along have been rolling their eyes for the past 40 minutes. Stores still operate across Asia, in parts of Europe, and in Latin America. The British stores closed in 2018 along with the American ones. And the brand itself has been resurrected. A company called WHP Global acquired control of the name in 2021. And since then, Toys R Us shops have opened inside hundreds of Macy's department stores in the United States, alongside a handful of new flagship locations. You can walk into one today. Jeffrey is on the wall. It is a real store, and children really do love it. But be clear about what it is. It is a licensed name, operating inside somebody else's building. The company that owned 2,000 of its own buildings, that employed 64,000 people, that once sold a quarter of all the toys in America. That company does not exist and will not be coming back. So here is the verdict plainly. Toys R Us was not killed by Amazon, although Amazon took a decade from it through a contract that was breached. It was not killed by Walmart, although Walmart broke its pricing model and took its crown. It was not killed by iPads or by children who stopped playing, because children did not stop playing, and the company was still selling $11 billion a year on the day it filed. Toys R Us was killed by a purchase. On a Thursday in March 2005, Its own future earnings were pledged as collateral to buy it. And from that morning forward, every dollar the company might have spent on a new store, a working website, or a lower price on a Lego set had a prior claim against it. Given 13 years, that arrangement will hollow out any business on earth. Toys R Us was simply the most beloved one it happened to. The strangest part is that the founder had seen this exact thing before. In 1974, Charles Lazarus watched a mountain of debt at interstate stores destroy a company, while his healthy little toy division stood inside the wreckage, thriving and helpless, unable to save itself. 44 years later, the same thing happened. Only this time, the healthy little division was the whole company, and there was nothing left standing outside it to be blamed. He was right in 1948, and he stayed right. A family only buys one crib, but every child needs toys, and they need new ones every year, forever. The children never stopped coming. The money just had somewhere else to be. Next time, we opened the doors of a store where you could not touch anything at all, where you walked in, wrote your order on a paper slip, handed it to a stranger, and watched your purchase ride out of a hidden warehouse on a conveyor belt. It was one of the largest retailers in America. It invented the shopping experience we all use today, and it has been so completely forgotten that most people under 40 have never heard the name. That story is next.